All right. We are going to be going live in just a few minutes. Wait a few minutes.
I don't see it.
All right, we are live streaming right now on Facebook. I want to welcome everyone to the Fullerton and ask to invite.
A los que hablan español y prefieran el teléfono por los tres números.
So there's links to that interpretation globe at the bottom of your screen, and you could join the English and Spanish. All right. So Leanna, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you and invite you to welcome us.
Thank you so much, Debbie. And thank you all of you for joining us today. My name is Leanna Percucci. I'm the board chair of the Fullerton Collaborative. And those of you that don't know about the Fullerton Collaborative, we are a nonprofit organization in the city of Fullerton that works together with businesses, nonprofits, the city of Fullerton, all of the different parts of the city of Fullerton, and residents to help Fullerton become a better place by bringing you together to connect and collaborate. So we're very happy that for the second time, and appreciate that Councilmember Ahmad Zara has reached out to us to have these really important community conversations. Last June, we met with the chief and did our first town hall together, and the chief was really able to help us understand the different aspects of the police force here in Fullerton and how they work together with the city and the community. And he was really looking forward to sharing some updates with us. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Ahmad and the chief.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Leanna.
Only 14 people watching.
I'm the council member here in Fullerton. I represent District 5, which is the southeast part of Fullerton. I know that public safety is very important to me and to the residents I represent. And so it's important that we have these continued discussions. And sometimes these discussions tend to be tough, and but it's important that we have them nonetheless. Otherwise, we won't be able to improve on public safety and make our community safer and better for everyone. Before we start, I do want to just if we can acknowledge all the folks that died in the killing and in the shooting that we saw in Colorado during his use. So I just wanted to make sure that we honor their memory. A lot of work that needs to be still, but we bring it back forward here and we do here. Last year we hosted a meeting also after a really some tragic events that happened, especially with the killing of George Floyd and many others. And so we really want to make sure that we are communicating with the public and that we are listening to the public and making sure that we are improving on our public safety. I want to thank the collaborative for joining me in this and making sure that we're all in this together, and this is what the collaborative theme is. That's why it's called the collaborative. And so I always appreciate their partnership in this and other things that we've done before. I also want to thank our Chief of Police, Fullerton, Chief of Police Bob Dunn, who has really been generous with his time. I know one of his passions is communicating with the public and public engagements, and I think this is a really important asset to have in a chief. He answered a lot of tough questions last time and listened, and we did a lot of work since the last meeting, and this is why I'm happy to have him here tell us about all that work that we have accomplished since the last year. Government works slow. It's one of the frustrating things for me as a council member who wants to get things done immediately, but this is the nature of public policy and public service, that sometimes things take their time in the process to do everything. But as long as we get where we want, as long as we are on the path, that is what's important, and that's why we're here today, to make sure that we are continually updating our community with what we're doing. So without further ado, I want to pass it on to our chief to tell us a little bit about what has been going on since the last time we met. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, ma'am. I appreciate having the opportunity to come back and connect with all of you again. I think it's been a bit of a tough year for everybody, responding to COVID and the changes that's caused in our community and our ability to connect with each other more physically. I mean, we can do it virtually, but physically it makes it difficult. And so I don't know about you, but I think I felt a little bit of a disconnect from even people in my family as a result of COVID-19. So as we look like we're turning the corner, and I hope that that continues, we at the Fullerton Police Department are excited to get back out in the community and host our Pizza with the Police, Coffee with the Cop. Summer's coming. We usually have a popsicle with the police. So look for all those things to come out again from your police department. Last year, I'll talk about some of the highlights that we were still able to accomplish while our staffing has diminished. And so at the onset of COVID, and when it looked as if revenues were going to go down, the city manager approached me and said, Chief, you're no longer authorized for 140 sworn. We'd like you to go down to 125 sworn. At our last meeting, we had 123, and we were working towards 140. So today, the Fullerton Police Department has 118 sworn officers in our ranks. And I'll get more into that as the questions go on and explain the reasons for the numbers. But what we've done as a result of some of the conversations I had with this group and others in our community is we have added a position into our internal affairs area that solely looks at our uses of force. It looks at our officers' application of de-escalation techniques. This sergeant also puts out a monthly report to the command staff so we can notice trends immediately and train to those trends. And it's an impact in a department when we take a supervisor out of the field and put them into another assignment, but I think it's an important assignment. This sergeant also is responsible for what we call our major incident review. And in all uses of force, significant uses of force, a traffic collision involving an officer where there's injuries, or any time that I deem that I want a deeper dive into a particular incident, this sergeant conducts a major incident review. And within 48 hours of the incident, he's giving us an update and a briefing on all the facts as we know them at that time. It's something that we employed at the agency that I came from, and it's something that we're employing here. We've also invested in technology to better analyze our body-worn camera videos. So when we do receive complaints where a person believes that they were singled out because of protected classification, then we can more easily and readily audit those videos to determine whether or not that complaint has merit and if our employees are engaged in behavior that we don't want them engaged in. So we've made great strides, I think, in those areas as far as increased accountability. We also transitioned from a 2-platform system. We used to keep track of use of force in a different system from our internal affairs system, and it created a disparate kind of review process. All of it is centralized in one particular area now so that we have access to the data as we need it. And I can make important decisions as the chief of police as to tactics, training, policy, procedures, equipment needs. And so I think in some ways that was a big change for us this last year. Another thing that came up, and it was in some ways related to the conversation we had. I was looking back in my folder from our last town hall, and I found, Chief, you have 30,000 hours of overtime you're spending in patrol. And so this year, because of the reductions that I talked about, all of the command staff went through an exercise of we need to figure out how we can staff our patrol in a way that doesn't really amounts of overtime, but at the same time still provides for the basic safety of our community. So one of our guiding forces was that conversation that we had with you about the reduction in overtime and being in some ways more responsible with our funding. And so we have pared down areas of our department and transitioned them into patrol. We also now require our detectives to work in a 6-month period. They have to work 3 days of patrol. That cuts down on overtime. And we're about ready to go through that exercise again. Unfortunately, the amount of people we have in the pipeline to become police officers is not going to meet the amount of people that will be leaving. And so we will be forced to make further cuts. And part of that conversation will be the use of overtime as was outlined in our previous conversation. So it seems like that during this COVID, we were still able to accomplish much, I think. And we did that by maximizing use of technology and using community input as our guiding principles as we make decisions about how policing is going to be done in the city of Fullerton.
Thank you so much, Chief. I'm going to just pause for just a second. We've asked that you slow down a little bit so that the translation can happen. So
Sure.
great information. Yes, thank you.
And I just want to thank our translator, who also is translating to Spanish simultaneously in another room where we've got some folks who are speaking Spanish. So just shout out to you. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Continue, please.
And that's all I have for my initial report, and I see that we're going to get to some additional questions, so.
Yeah, okay, excellent. So I'm going to go ahead and start. I know that we referenced the budget, and I think the budget is something that everybody talks about. Our city budget is overall about approximately 200 million. Half of that is dedicated funds like sewer and water and so on, and the other half is called the general fund, which basically is public safety and everything, and a lot of things like community services, this community center where we're at, the library has its own. But all of these services are in the general fund, and we are, but public safety is the largest, number, the largest percentage, but that's because the department is so big, and there's a lot of heavy gear. There's also not just sworn officers, but there's also support staff that also get paid. And so it is very challenging, but like the chief said, when I started 2 years ago on this council, our line items, our budget was, we had budgeted for 140 officers, and now we have only 120. So, and those were defunded positions over time, and not just, part of it is because the city just doesn't have enough money. And so, so there is an erosion of our staff that's happening, whether we like it or not. And so, but what I'd like to ask is, could you, this is the question that on the budget is, as far as when you look at the budget, I mean, how do you analyze how many police officers are needed on the street? I know there are some standards out there, but maybe you can elaborate on that.
Sure, and for the exercise that we just recently went through as far as how our staffing model was going to be in a COVID type of reduction, we looked at a few things: call volume. We also looked at 10 years worth of our deployments to see how many officers we were deploying 10 years ago versus how many officers we're deploying today. And then we look at need, like times of the day when they're needed to be out there. And then we overlay that with other units that have patrol-esque responsibilities. And by that, I mean motorcycle officers or gang enforcement detectives who might be out. They can still handle calls, but are not considered part of the deployment. So when we took all that into consideration, each watch commander for their respective shifts, because sometimes on a Monday night, you don't need as many people as you need on a Friday night. And I think that would make sense to anybody who is watching. And so I'm trying to slow down because I realize I'm probably talking fast for you again, sir. I'm sorry. And so we took all that into account. Each watch commander put a number on their team, taking into consideration all of those that they felt was necessary to safely patrol on their particular watch. And then we made that number our most important number to meet. And then from there, we filled all the ancillary spots. And I say ancillary. In essence, a police department's really, their core mission is to provide, when you call for help, we come. And when you report a crime, somebody investigates it on the backside. Beyond that, it's kind of like extra services. And in some ways, a gang unit is extra services. Our directed enforcement team, and since we last spoke, we had a fairly big case here. We had 40 some odd residents in our city that were victimized by some residential burglars. Our directed enforcement team was the lead on that and apprehended those suspects. That's kind of an extra added benefit. And in some ways now, our traffic unit is. Some years ago, there was 15 motorcycle officers in the city of Fullerton. Today, there's 2. And so sometimes in these conversations, we have to question how helpful it is to have 2 motor officers versus putting those motor officers in cars and having them handle calls for service and perhaps write tickets when time permits. And so those are all things that we consider as we look at how we deploy the resources that we have. And our greatest resource is our people. So as I indicated previously, we're holding about 20 vacancies on the sworn side. We're holding 13 vacancies on a non-sworn side. We have people who are working completely opposite shifts. We have managers who are working graveyard. We're doing the best we can to continue to provide the services in the city that we need to provide with the staffing and the budget that we have.
And I have another question. One of the things that I'm very passionate about is prevention, and I know that we had talked a lot and worked on trying to add another community liaison officer. We had one officer, and I know we've succeeded in doing that. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that as well.
Yes, sir. Thanks to the support of the city council, the city manager, we were able to add a community liaison officer. And what we did was we reclassified a community service officer, which would be someone you encounter at our front counter when you come in, who supervises the cadets. We took one of those positions and converted it. And the idea is that we have someone else who's community centered that can help us create inroads and start conversations with members of our community. This particular person also got interested in this position because we were able to get a company, Canine Companions International, or sorry, Canine Companions for Independence. And they gave us a therapy dog, someone that we could take to neighborhoods who are in crisis or have experienced crisis. And we could use the dog as a vehicle to start conversations and kind of break down barriers. And so we were successful in implementing that program this year. I do have to say that this person also on payroll weeks helps submit payroll because we've had to let go staff as it relates to COVID. So we have her doing multiple things, but her core mission, and she's subject to call out. So if we have a tragedy in the middle of the night, she can come out and help with those situations. And we find that creating that contact kind of contemporaneous to the incident really does help not only the officers involved, but also our members of our community who need additional support.
We've seen, because of the our cuts, and we've seen a bit of petty crime going on, especially in the south side. I've seen it definitely. I know there's been a lot of catalytic converters thefts and crimes of that nature. How are you responding to that, and what improvements have you done in response times as well?
So that's a tough one for us because a lot of what's happened, and especially because of COVID, is the system that's behind the arrest isn't prepared to support what happens post-arrest. So a lot of members in the community, for example, will express their frustration with the police department when an individual is arrested for a misdemeanor crime. And we take them to our jail, they're processed, and then the county jail refuses to take them. So they're back out in the streets, and oftentimes these victims are seeing the offender in their neighborhood within hours of their arrest, and it creates a little bit of friction with their review of our service. We do the best we can within the confines of the law. We have made arrests of catalytic converter thieves. We were actually very lucky because a member of the community witnessed it, called us, and we were able to respond and apprehend the individuals. And for those of you who don't know, one of the reasons why people steal those is because they have precious metals inside, and they can sell them for value so that can be melted down and someone can get the precious metals from it. And so that's why we're seeing them on the rise. But in total, we're also seeing, I think, a more than usual amount of offenders released from our prison system because of COVID restrictions. Every Saturday morning at about 8 o'clock, the California Department of Corrections emails the chiefs in the region and indicates who's coming out early because of good behavior and all other things, COVID related. And so we know that more offenders are coming out absent that net to catch them and get them into reentry because of COVID restrictions. So it's kind of like dueling priorities. We certainly want members of our community who are coming back from paying their debt to society and doing what the judge has ordered them to do, to have a safety net to grab them and say, we can help you get onto a path of success. Unfortunately, because of COVID, that hasn't always been there for them.
And speaking of COVID, my last question is that we got a lot is on enforcement during COVID, and especially with parking enforcement and traffic enforcements and so on. Could you explain a little bit where we are with that? And I know we're resuming enforcement now, but we also don't have the level of staffing to enforce properly. So a little bit of a dilemma here.
It is a bit of a dilemma. And I would say, if you were to ask me kind of my taking the temperature of the community, is about 50-50. 50% of the people that call say, we need you to start enforcing traffic parking issues again. And about 50% of the community says, please don't start enforcing them because we're still home and we don't have a way to move our car. And so there is this kind of tug of war in the community as far as expectation. We did not fill many of our, in fact, we have no part-time traffic ticket writers anymore. We have 2 full-timers who actually only do vehicle abatement. And so we contracted out with a company called SP Plus. SP Plus was originally brought on, for those of you who follow the city council meetings, for the downtown parking program. And we just added their services to handle street sweeping and overnight parking. Some of the feedback we got in our last town hall meeting was that it seemed like there wasn't a fair application of the overnight parking ordinance, and that maybe the police department spent an inordinate amount of time in a particular area versus another. The fact of the matter is we only had one person doing it, and they kind of just did hotspot to hotspot. But now contracting it out, we have a more even enforcement across the city. That group, SP Plus, started last Monday night, and they've been issuing warnings to some in the community. It looks a lot like a citation, but if you read it closely, it very clearly tells you that it's a warning. But on April 5th, we intend to resume enforcement of street sweeper and overnight parking, as well as the rest of the parking violations that we've been kind of triaging as a result of COVID-19.
So good. I do know we want to talk about also homelessness and homelessness response, but I know there's questions in there, so I'm going to go ahead and start the question process, and I'm sure we'll have that discussion. There's also been some really good improvements and updates on that and how the city is going to respond. I know we have the regional program HOPE. So before we do start, I'd love if you can give us a little bit of a brief on Project HOPE, and then we can start the questions.
Okay. If you've been following the council meetings, there's been a couple presentations about this, but for the last 4 years, the city of Fullerton has enjoyed funding from the state of California that resulted in what's called the North Orange County Public Safety Task Force. The task force was initially, the move to fund them was done by then Senator Josh Newman, who is a senator again. And 10 cities within the North area were given $20 million over 4 years. So it wasn't $20 million every year. It was $5 million divided amongst those 10 cities. And of that, 60% had to go to community-based organizations, and the other 40% went to the individual departments to fund things like our HLO officers or homeless liaison officers, or buy specific equipment that could help us with that. And so we've enjoyed that for this last 4 years, but that funding ends on June 30th of this year. So I think what we've built through that program has been very impactful, and I'll explain why. The North Orange County Public Safety Task Force had a very large focus on community building organizations like Solidarity and Project Rebound. And one of the things that we also required as being funded through our task force was we put on workshops for these nonprofits to get tools to help them sustain after the funding ended, because we never know if we're going to be able to be continued. And so we do have an eye at making sure that community-based organizations are here, they're here to stay, and that what we've been providing for the last 4 years is able to continue. That doesn't help the other side, the city side, that we just explained kind of at length, our financial challenges. And I'm faced with decisions about how I'm going to continue to pay for things like CityNet without that funding. And so the idea of the HOPE Center was born. And what HOPE stands for is Homeless Outreach and Proactive Engagement. And the idea behind it is to take all of the stakeholders who have an interest in interacting with our homeless neighbors and getting them onto a path, whatever path that might be for the individual, to success. And so we identified a building that's located next to St. Jude that's owned by the city. And that building will be what I call the synergistic hub of people who come together. And I'm probably dating myself a little bit, but there was a show called Care Bears when I was younger, and the Care Bears would stare at the issue and all work at the issue together in a very productive way. And that's what I'm hoping that this center will do for us. And so what I mean by that is the police department will of course contribute our homeless liaison officers who have special training in dealing with members of our homeless community. We already have an established relationship with the Orange County Health Care Agency and their mental health team. We have a clinician that rides with our homeless liaison officers. We will ask that individual to go there and ask for a bigger commitment from the health care agency. We're looking at doing a community paramedicine program with our fire department so that our homeless neighbors who are experiencing a need for medical attention, or if their particular crisis at the moment of contact involves medical need, that we can get it for them. And so we're taking all of these partners and putting them in one place so that we can work together. And then we're going to work together without respect for borders. So if on a given day, a Buena Park transient is in mental health crisis and would benefit at a call for service from having a mental health clinician there, but the only one working in the region is working in Fullerton, the Fullerton officer will drive licensed siren to Buena Park to bring that expert to the call to provide the services that person needs to get the most successful outcome. And so I mentioned Buena Park because there's 10 cities involved now. At first, we're going to do it with Fullerton and Buena Park to try it out. And then we will invite any other city that wants to join us. Our hope is that, and I don't mean no pun intended, our hope is that this idea takes off and perhaps these centers can be duplicated in other regions so that all of us are working to one common goal. And it's not a police-led effort, it's a police-supported effort and led by the experts in the field.
Yeah, thank you. So if anyone knows, this really came out from the conversations that we had last year. I know there's a program called the Cahoots program in Oregon, if anybody knows about it. This is a similar type of program, a little bit modified to make it a little bit more regional because we as a city can't handle it financially by ourselves. So we need to make sure that we have other partners come in. But this is the type of model, and so that the first response becomes a civilian response and becomes a response that is coming with services. And like the chief said, the PD is a support system as opposed to a first responder. So that is on that. Let's open it up to the questions now, and then. Do
you mind if I add 2 more points on that? I was kind of remiss to say that I talked a little bit about CityNet. My funding ends, and I don't have a mechanism to continue to pay them. So the city, through the Community and Economic Development Department, is bringing on 2 part-time homeless case managers who will work in the field, and so is Buena Park, and they're using CDBG funds to do that. And then also the building itself does need some improvements to make it workable for those partners, and that's being paid for through CARES funds. So no general funds are being used to accomplish this, except for the 2 HLOs that will be decided.
Yeah, obviously these topics are wide, and we can talk on this particular topic. We can talk an hour. So we're kind of skimming through this. I'm hoping that we can cover as much as possible. And then, if anybody has any follow-up questions for in-depth, we are both open. I know I can even connect you with other staff members who have more knowledge of working on these projects as well. All right, so we're going to turn it over to our Fullerton Collaborative board, who will each ask a question. And I don't know, Leanna, if you want to introduce them, or maybe they'll introduce themselves.
Yes, we're going to go ahead and get started. The questions, and we are actually getting a lot of questions here on our chat along with our Facebook page. So we will be addressing them, and I invite those that are able to submit those questions, and I will be including that as well. So the questions that are being asked were asked by the community, and that the board members are asking on behalf of the community. Let me repeat that. It's not the board members' questions, these are the community questions. And so the first question that we have is actually going to be asked by our board chair, Leanna, who's there in the room, and it was asked on behalf of the city of Fullerton. So Leanna, can you share that?
Yes, so the first question we received from the community is how is the city addressing the underlying issues of structural and institutional racism in its work? So Ahmad and I were discussing this, and we were thinking that we should start this with Ahmad answering this question.
Yeah,
and then maybe Chief, you could elaborate how the police force is doing that specifically.
Yeah, so this is certainly, again, we could talk about this for a lot, and I think we're missing our city manager here to come and explain to us some of the things he's doing. But, there's a zero tolerance for racism. I mean, that's where we need to start. And then you look at the functions within the institution. You look at each department department. And we are going, since actually for a couple of years now, our city manager has been going through each department and doing reforms in each department, whether it's structural reforms or whether it's staffing reforms or more efficiencies. And from that, you create this a better environment for work. I'm not going to get into all the details because I'd like to, I'm hoping I'm going to do another town hall with our city manager and we can talk about those. So I want to focus it back on our chief, because I think one of the important things is that in the police department itself, there's two aspects to this. One, within the department itself, and as far as our diversity of our employment, of our staffing, and also and the other component is how we respond to the public, because we have a very diverse community. And how do we find, how is it that the police department responds, and especially with incidences that are potentially could be racial in nature?
Sure, and it's a very timely question given what's happening currently in our country. The first, I think you said it best when it doesn't exist. We cannot allow any type of racist behavior to take hold, especially in our police department. We are charged with tremendous responsibility in our community, and we cannot engage in that type of behavior. We will not engage in that type of behavior. It is not tolerated. And every employee in our department knows that if anyone engages in that behavior, it's to be reported immediately, and I will take swift action to address it. That's first and foremost. That's the basis from which we start. And how do we foster an environment where it doesn't exist or it doesn't take hold in our behavior as officers and community guardians? And that's in what you mentioned, sir, is having a department that's reflective of the community that we're serving. We actively try to recruit from members of our community from various diverse backgrounds. And we're pretty successful at it. I mean, we're not a 50-50 like we would like to be, but we do have, for our region, a lot more female police officers than most agencies around us, and we're very fortunate to do that. And we also focus on that in the non-sworn side of our house. And so there's two sides kind of to a police department. There's the ones that go out and answer the 911 calls and do the police work, but then there's people that you might encounter that are not sworn officers, and we have the same expectation of them as we do with the community guardians, our police officers. And then let's talk about how the encounters with the community would be addressed. I think first and foremost, we have many routes in which people can express their, and sometimes it's positive interactions with our officers, and other times when we don't meet their expectations, they know how they can get a hold of us and have us look into their concern. There also, our Assembly and our Senate for the state of California has mandated that on all of our complaint forms, there is a specific box that anyone can check to say, I felt like my race, creed, national origin was the impetus for my contact with the police, that it was wrong. And we are charged with investigating that and then reporting that investigation to the Department of Justice so they can have oversight of the investigation of what we did to try to determine its validity. And so there is that safeguard. It's also the other safeguard that comes into effect is our employees. If they witness behavior, not just amongst officers or employees, but amongst members of our community who might engage in behavior based on a protected class, they're to take action immediately. And so I think we have a very strong stance on that. We are not a department that is focused on treating people differently because of who they are or where they're from. We are fair, impartial responders and community guardians. As far as in our community, what do we see as far as crimes that seem to be motivated by race or any other protected class? We're another fortunate in that the reports are low. Now, whether that means that the community doesn't feel like they can report it and have an ear to do that, I want you to know you do have an ear with the Fullerton Police Department. So if you feel like you've been the victim of a crime because of who you are, let us know, and we want to investigate that. We've had 0 incidents reported to the police department as far as Asian hate right now. When we saw what happened, we took an internal look at all of our reports to make sure that we weren't missing anything, and we have not found anything. that would indicate that there's any type of crimes on the rise in our community. We did have one incident last year in which someone sent anti-Semitic, like a box of anti-Semitic material here to the library. It was anonymous. We took it as a hate crime and reported it as such, but it wasn't geared towards any particular person. It was more anti-Semitic in nature. And that's the only one within the last year that we've had. So as a community, I say it's fortunate that we don't have a lot of reported incidents of that, but that doesn't mean it's not happening. And for those of you who don't feel like you can report it, please report it to us. We want to look into it.
Yeah, I think reporting is extremely essential. We also, I know that the police department has been doing a lot of outreach in the community. I know pre-COVID, when it was easier, obviously, but especially in South Fullerton, when we have a large Latino population as well, and often there's been historically and issues of discrimination against Latinos but I'm seeing a little bit more now rapport and a connection between the police department and our Latino population, especially with the health. And I want to give a shout out to the Center for Healthy Neighborhoods that have been really pivotal in South Fullerton in bringing folks together and doing a lot of outreach and connection with, especially on public safety. I know it's important for them. But could you give us a little bit on your work in South Fullerton?
Sure. I think there's two contributing factors to that, and it's not necessarily me that creates that connection. I think first and foremost, one of the groups that had existed at our police department for quite some time that I feel was underutilized was my Chiefs Advisory Council. And there are members on that council who are specifically from South Fullerton. It's meant to be representative of the various neighborhoods. If you look on our website, you can find out what district each member lives in so that you know who to identify with. Should you have a need to contact me and you don't feel comfortable doing it, just you and I, you can go through that third party. So I have council members who live in that area who very much communicate to me the concerns of the community. One of the things that we're working on right now with the Center for Healthy Neighborhoods, for example, is this fear of reporting crime. And it still stems from the potential, or there are members of our community who believe that immigration will come if they report it to the police. We do not participate in immigration enforcement. We want to create a safe community in Fullerton for everyone, absent where you're from or what language you speak. And so we want you to report it to us and let us walk through that process with you. What we've also found is maybe a little bit of education is needed for what happens after you report it. So if someone were to report a crime and we actually catch the person, there is some things that that person has to do on the back end to realize a successful prosecution of that case. It's one thing to report it, it's another thing to follow through with it. And so we're working with the community right now to demystify that. One of the other barriers we found with our non-English speaking community here in Fullerton is that oftentimes they're dissuaded by the phone call they make because they get a host of questions. And so my public information officer is working on a video series right now in multiple languages that will help demystify that process. So what people can expect when they call the police and the questions we're asking, and more importantly, why we ask them when you call, so that it helps them prepare for that report. So we're working on that. The other thing that we've done this year, and really I have to give credit to one of your members, Jason Phillips. Jason's been a long time chaplain for our organization, and he felt like other religions were underrepresented in our group. And so we've brought on additional members of clergy from various denominations this year, which I think also gives us a different perspective. And as incidents have happened, unfortunately, across our country, we can hear the perspective of that particular group and try to respond and connect in a better way. And I think if you take nothing else away from today's town hall, we can't be successful unless we create the connection. And all of our responses should be focused on creating that connection so that we can be as effective as we possibly can for you and the community.
Fantastic.
Okay.
Go to the next question.
Yes, actually, I'm going to follow up to a question in regards to the advisory council. Jan wants to know how one can apply to become on your advisory council.
So generally, we other members of the council will nominate folks from the community to say, hey, this particular person has shown interest in the police department and wants to be more involved, and here's why. Generally, that's how someone becomes a member. But you can also email me directly and express your interest. I've only brought in one person since I've been chief. The rest have all been long-serving members who have served from different administrations, which I think is also an important kind of historical look back at the department and what we've done. And so I value their input. So I would say either reach out to one of the members of the advisory council who's listed on our website, or directly to me. And then usually what we'll do is have you come in and talk to me, and we'll discuss kind of your interest in why you want to be a member of the group. And then that's pretty much it. It's very low key, because the idea is we have a connection.
Okay, thank you. And then there's also a couple of comments here that I want to follow up regarding the incident on May 27th. So can you share with us how officers are being trained to de-escalate mental health individuals and situation? Erica was wanting to know what the department has done in response to the 27th incident.
Okay, and I have to put out a little bit of a disclaimer that I can't speak directly to that incident as it's under litigation, and I'm prohibited from talking about it, but I think I can provide some context in two areas. The first one is in what happens after a police officer uses force, whether it's lethal or not. There's independent investigations that go on, and so the first one is the Fullerton Police Department will investigate the actions of the individual involved for any type of criminality. And so that, if you put it into context, if a crime had been committed, there was a pursuit, we're investigating the pursuit part and all the crimes that went along with that to submit for criminal filing. So that's one investigation. The other investigation, and probably the most important for our community, is the investigation that's done by the Orange County District Attorney's Office. That entity is the entity that is charged with looking at the actions of the officer or officers involved and determining whether there was any criminality in their behavior. That's the other investigation going on. The third one is the internal major incident review that's going on, where we look at tactics, training, policy, procedure, equipment, so that if we had a similar incident happen tomorrow, what can we do differently as an organization to affect an outcome? And so those are the three things. That's how the process plays out. The DA's process is completely independent. I don't call up and say, hey, I want you to do this. They don't do that. Their job is to look at it and then render a finding. You can find the letters on the DA's site if you want to see what kind of detail that they provide in their analysis. And a lot of their analysis is rooted in case law as it relates to officer use of force. So that's
Thank you.
Now, as far as the post-training part, we go through a post of training. In the academy, officers receive 21 hours of de-escalation training. We also require all of our public contact employees, not just police officers, but anyone that has contact with the public, to have 16 additional hours of crisis intervention and mental health training before they hit the street. Our field training officers go through an additional 48 hours of training so that they can better impart that on the new officers and build on what they learned in the academy. And then our homeless liaison officers, they go through 96 additional hours of mental health training, because they're the ones that have the most contact with our most vulnerable. And so there is a lot of, and then there's a discussion going on right now in our assembly and our state senate to require additional training. So this year we are due to start our entire training again. So we have, all of this stuff is in service. We have to continue to do this every few years. And so we're going to start our 10 hours of tactical communication, crisis intervention, arrest control techniques, and use of force training. All of that encompasses de-escalation components. And now the legislature and the Senate are going to add 4 additional hours. They don't know what the curriculum is going to be, but they are going to tell police departments in the state of California what additional training they need to receive in this area. And they're working on that curriculum right now. And I'll explain how that happens. So if you remember, in the wake of the George Floyd incident, there was this national call for the banning of the chokehold, or what we call in policing the carotid restraint hold. So the governor called the head of post, and that's the California Commission on Peace Officer Standards and Training. If you look at it from maybe like a school point of view, that's the accreditation body that kind of dictates your curriculum for police officers, what they need in the academy and what they needed in service training. And so he called the head of post, who he appoints, and said, you're no longer to certify that training. And so in its decertification, it basically removed it from our ability to use it. And if you go to our website, we're required by law to post all of our training bulletins and our policy manual on there. I think it's training bulletin 20-1. It was stopped, the use was stopped in the city of Fullerton immediately. And so that body, through the governor, the legislature, will be dictating additional training that we'll be going to and adding to our 10 hours of mandatory training this year. And it will center around the area of crisis intervention and tactical communication as it relates to people in mental health crisis. I hope that answers.
Thank you so much. So the next question, we're going to move into some of the follow-up to the COVID and the pandemic. And so I'm going to invite Katie. She's a board member of the Fullerton Collaborative, and also she is a member, works for the Cal State University Fullerton in the community relations. So Katie, do you want to ask your question that was brought to you by the community?
Hi, Chief Dunn. I wanted to ask, as the community begins to reopen, how can the community be helpful to report businesses or community members who are not following COVID guidelines?
Great question. I think if the best way for me to answer that is to look back historically now at this last year of kind of going through that as a community. I've been really quite impressed, I think, with Fullerton as a whole and their response to the guidelines issued by CDC, and they've been a bit of a moving target, right? And I think, again, maybe like parking enforcement, you can find a group of people who think that the rules are completely debunked, and a group of people who think the rules should be followed, verbatim. And so, oftentimes in our encounters with people, we become aware very quickly of what side of that kind of equation that they're on. But Fullerton during this pandemic has really been good about making each other feel like you're respectful of each other. And I'll give you, for instance, when the lockdown order first came into effect, for example, businesses were still open and people would call us and say, hey, Chief, there's a business over here, it's open, it's not supposed to be open, it's not essential. With guidance from our DA, we know that we're not going to go in there and arrest everybody who's in there for violating the CDC guidelines. What we do is we take an education first approach. And generally speaking, that's enough to say, hey, it doesn't fall within the guidelines. You're not an essential business as outlined by the state of California. We need you to close and be in compliance. Oftentimes that was enough to get someone to come into compliance. If we had to escalate that, what the escalation looked like was the watch commander responded to the call. They took out the order that was issued by Dr. Chow and read it verbatim to the person in charge of the facility on camera so that we had it documented. And then we would write a report and send it to the district attorney's office saying this person wasn't in compliance. And whatever happened after that was up to the district attorney's office. But I would say in situations where it escalated to that official reading, we didn't have to have anybody arrested for it. So we have not encountered a situation where people have not voluntarily come into compliance. I think what we need to be prepared for, though, as we come out of this is businesses have been struggling for quite some time now. And so I think we're going to see folks who are more desperate than they were probably at the beginning. And so if we were to have another lockdown, we would employ exactly the same tactic in the beginning. But I think we're going to encounter more folks in our community who are more desperate to make ends meet and provide if another lockdown were to occur. And so I, like many in the community, are hoping it does not happen, of course.
I hope not too, and that's why it's important to get everybody vaccinated and then keep wearing the masks until the CDC tells us that it's okay for us to start resuming normal life.
Excellent. Thank you. So that we have another question. We are going to follow up with talking about homeless. I know that we mentioned that earlier. And so I'm going to invite Barry to ask the next question that was asked by the community members. If you want to go ahead and unmute yourself and share that question.
Good evening. This is Barry Ross from St. Jude Medical Center. Fullerton and the County of Orange will be receiving a significant amount of funding from the American Rescue Plan. Funding could be utilized to address some of the underlying issues that resulted in some communities being more negatively impacted by COVID, including homeless and minority communities. Will there be an opportunity for the voices of those most impacted by COVID to be part of the planning process for the use of these funds? And will consideration be made on utilizing these funds for longer term solutions to homelessness? Thank you.
Thank you, Barry, for that question. The city of Fullerton will receive $34,700,000 approximately as a from the American Rescue Act. We are grateful that we're getting this money. This is one-time money, so and it will be used. We will get the first half this year and another half next year. And there's still a lot of details as far as how this money will be spent and used. There are restrictions. We're still trying to figure out what those restrictions are. What we do know is that this money has a lot of what's in this is money to be used for revenue lost by the city that resulted in cutting services, cutting employees, cutting salaries, and so on. But there's also a lot that will be used towards rent assistance programs, homelessness solutions, and other community-based services that and families and individuals who were impacted during COVID. So there's a lot of that we know we'll be using for such services. We just don't know yet all the details as far as how much money from each of these categories. What I would advise the community and what I'd ask is that join our community, our city council meetings, and voice your concerns and your for what needs that you have. Share with your council members that represent you for what you think would be a necessity and a need in as far as what we're going to use this. But there will be, I think, in the next council meeting, there's going to be a special. We'll probably get an update from our city manager. I know the staff is going through some training right now with on this specific type of funding to figure out all the details, and then we will be updated in the next council meeting. As far as once we know exactly how we're going to be able to spend it, then what we can do is we can start outreaching into the community. I know some of it will be used also for nonprofits. So we'll start outreaching into the community to figure out how to bring in these partners and how to disperse this funding.
Great, thank you so much, Maud. I'm going to invite Bev Berryman. She's a board member of the Fullerton Collaborative and also a board member of the Clinton Services. So if you could ask the next community question.
All right, thank you. So speaking of funding, while the navigation centers have been successful in providing temporary shelter, many of the homeless are not able to be discharged into permanent housing due to the lack of affordable housing. How does this impact the ability to enforce the anti-camping ordinance, and what longer-term strategies are needed to address this issue?
Let me answer a little bit of this first, and then I'll hand it over to you. So we've done a lot of short-term solutions in the last 2 years, which were necessary, opening navigation centers, such as the one in Fullerton and the two that we partnered with, the regional ones in Buena Park and Placentia. It is not enough. We do need long-term solutions. I know the county is doing mental health, a mental health facility in Orange that also will be very helpful. But in order to start planning for affordable housing, we are actually looking at updating our general plan. We're looking at doing an overlay zone, so looking at areas in our city that could accommodate affordable housing. And it is a process, but it takes time because we can only zone for it. We don't actually, cities don't build housing. We just zone and accommodate for it so that the developers can come in. But we are actively also looking at land that we have to see where we can, what city-owned land, and this is also part of state laws and new state laws about surplus land, to see if we can have some of it used for affordable housing as well. And I know we put out an RFP, a request for proposals for one particular city-owned property, 1600 West Commonwealth, and hope that we can find some affordable housing there. As far as the response to, it is a tricky one. I'm going to give that one to you, Chief, to answer that part.
So there's case law out of the Ninth Circuit that says that absent a place for someone to go and their refusal to do so, then cities cannot enforce their anti-camping ordinance. So we adhere to that in Fullerton. We are in what's called the North Spa, or the North Service Planning area. Our city is in a settlement agreement with an attorney who was representing the homeless community. And so oftentimes when we do any type of effort, the attorney is consulted, as well as federal judge David Carter. We had a very specific outreach and engagement session probably about 2.5 months ago now, where the judge was down here and went with our officers and outreach workers and county health workers to the various encampments and interacted with the homeless. I think that was good on two fronts. One, it offered services that were not normally available at kind of off hours, especially health services. And it also gave the judge the idea of the scope of our issue here in Fullerton. And so we use that as kind of our basis, or we consult with him before we take any enforcement action as it relates to anti-camping. We get calls, a lot of our calls are centered around members of our homeless community. And I think it's important for people to understand, especially folks that might be watching, that being homeless is not a crime. Sometimes members of our homeless community engage in criminal behavior, and that's an application for police. But the actual condition of being homeless is not a criminal in nature, and we don't treat it as such. Now, we have the two areas that seem to have been growing issues with recreational vehicle parking. And right now we're working with the attorney in our North Spa settlement to look at our ordinance as we pass it to see if there's any type of legal litmus that we need to put place on it before we can enforce as far as RVs go. But I think the better part of the question is, what is the long-term strategy for this? I think the Hope Center, at least from our department standpoint, is an area that we will be focused in and trying to provide the best service for the individual. The other thing that I failed to mention in the very opening part when talking about the Hope Center was this North Orange County Public Safety Task Force money also funded an app which we call Outreach Grid. There was a young entrepreneur who used to work for Instacart, and she instituted this application in Texas, where it kind of takes and aggregates all of homeless individuals' needs. So for example, if you're on parole, that narrows your ability to go into a shelter. If you have more than one animal, sometimes you can't get into shelter. If you have an aversion to heights, sometimes the only bed that's open is on the top bunk and you can't get on the top bunk. And so it allows us to get a person-specific view of what would best help this individual say yes to services. And then we partner with the shelters that we are part of to have a bed reservation system. So for instance, if I were homeless and you were to interact with me, you would fill out the data, it would be captured. You could, when a bed becomes available that meets my criteria, it would alert me on the app and I can reserve it. And then one of our officers or an ambulance or community paramedicine unit can take the individual, go contact them and take them to the resource that seems like it would fit their need at the time. And so I think what we're kind of focused on is taking the individualistic look at it and what is a barrier to this individual and why they would say no to services, and working with them to get them on a path to say yes, but knowing full well that there are some in our homeless community who are resistant completely to services. And there are some that, because of choices they made in their life, can't get into a particular location or service, and we know that that's small. And so we need to work with that individual a little bit more intensely on and capturing the bed when it's available, because there's not that many of them. I think we're going to see some great success with that in our onboarding of our case managers that are city specific, because now we have kind of that, for lack of a better term, boutique type of outreach that we're doing instead of more regional. We're looking at our Fullerton homeless individually and saying, what can we do to help get them on a path that they would get onto to be the most successful in their journey out of homelessness.
Right, thank you so much for sharing that information. So we do have, looking at 6 o'clock hour here, we have a couple more questions. We're good to ask those questions?
7.
So we will ask the next question is actually in Spanish. And so I've asked, see if, Iglet, are you able to translate that? Or Carlos? going to join
Amy
it.
has to join the other group.
Yeah, go ahead and click on the main group, Dr. Perez. Let's see. So click on off on the little world. All right. Okay, join that main room as we're waiting. We will also have another question regards, okay, there's not an off button, okay.
Debbie, I think Amon could help with that question.
Okay.
Yeah, so, well, my Spanish is not good, but I did understand the question. I need practice speaking, but I did understand the question. The question is about cannabis and enforcement, and I know there's, the city council did attempt to create an ordinance last year to regulate the use of cannabis and the sale of cannabis in the city in an attempt to create a more a safer experience for consumers, and is also trying to get a little bit more the ability for the city to enforce against the illegal dispensaries that are popping up in the city. However, the council, you know, this is policy, and the new council decided to rescind that ordinance. And so the question now is, how do we, from a police point of view, what is the response from a public safety when you get a call or you know a illegal dispensary somewhere, especially in South Fulton? A lot of them are concentrated in South Fulton. I know in my district there's plenty of them, one right up the street from where I live. So what is the police response and role in all of this? Before you answer that, you know, the state law says it's legal, consumption is legal, and we have to differentiate between what is what consumption is and versus what is
Possession.
Possession, yes. And so again, from a city point of view, we are trying to counter the illegal dispensaries. We don't have a lot of code enforcement officers to go after them. We're trying to add at least one position to do that. It is still a tougher thing than people realize. But again, public safety's perspective, please.
So from the police department, here in Fullerton, the police department has no specific legal role in response to illegal dispensaries. The entire process is managed by Community Economic Development and led by code enforcement. The only time that we're involved now is once the code enforcement officer is able to build a case and then get what they call an inspection warrant, where they go into the facility to see if in fact they are engaged in the criminal behavior that is being alleged. Then we accompany them to protect them while they conduct their inspection. I think members of our community are very, they know that this process takes a very long time to play out, and it's frustrating for them. I can tell you it's also frustrating for members of our code enforcement department, but they are committed to doing so, and we're committed to being the partner. It doesn't mean that you can't call us to alert us to the location of one. We work very well with them, and we're available kind of 24/7, so we can take the message and pass it along to our code enforcement officers. But it is a process that will be led by them unless or until the way that the municipal code is here or our processes change here.
I know that the police department, we just received a grant, which we usually receive for anti-tobacco. This was a question I never got a chance to ask actually at the council meeting. It was a consent calendar item. Could any of this be used for anti-cannabis educational awareness?
It's my understanding, no. It's focused strictly on tobacco, and by not participating in the state programs or we don't avail ourselves to any funding that comes from the state to help educate or enforce in the cannabis domain. So our efforts are strictly related to tobacco with that grant.
Yeah. And this is the problem with with money, with grant money that we get sometimes is that it's often restricted in how we use it. So a grant for tobacco can only be used on anti-tobacco. The state, for cities that regulate, that provide an ordinance and regulate cannabis, there is a state grant that I think it's almost nearly $1 million that is provided to the city that has a legal mechanism and regulatory mechanism for cannabis use and sale. But we rescinded orders, so therefore we didn't qualify for that $1 million grant that could have been used to create anti-cannabis education and awareness for youth specifically, and enforcement also against the illegal dispensaries. It is an administrative process because of the state laws, because it is a legal product. It's just the illegal dispensaries are illegal operations within the city.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for that. So I'm going to keep asking. There's 3 more questions I'm trying to get through. There's a lot more. And I just invite you, if you do have a question, please put it in our survey. I put the link in the chat, also on our Facebook page. I will send those off. And if the chief is able to take some time to respond to them, that'd be great. We will have your email addresses. That way we can respond to you as well. So the next question that was asked earlier was from Erica. She asked, Chief Dunn, do you have any updates regarding Fullerton's RV ban, and do you have any thoughts on it?
So right now we're enforcing the RV ordinance as passed by the council. And my thoughts are, it's the job of the police department to enforce the laws that are on the books that are constitutional. And so as that law works its way through that litmus, then we're not going to enforce that particular ordinance. It's important to note that there's many members of our community who are impacted by RVs being in their particular neighborhood or their area of business, and there's a direct correlation for them to the presence of individuals who are living in their recreational vehicles and a degradation in their ability to do business. And so there are other aspects that we will investigate and or enforce as it relates to areas where we see large congregations of recreational vehicles. And again, we do that kind of in concert with the attorney for our settlement agreement. We don't need the permission necessarily, but we of course want to include their thoughts on that. And the other thing I think is important too is when we are encountering members of our community who are homeless, our main focus is not enforcement. Our main focus is to provide outreach and get them on a pathway to, or on the journey that they want to be on out of homelessness. However, enforcement remains a tool. So for example, if there's 4 inoperable vehicles that have no motors and no seats parked behind their RV and they're not registered, it's likely those cars are going to be towed, but they're not being towed because the person's homeless. They're being towed because the vehicles don't meet the vehicle code and they're unregistered. And if the individual is living in an RV, we're not going to tow their car simply because it's a recreational vehicle, unless or until the ordinance is enacted and meets the legal litmus.
Okay, thank you.
Add to that, you know, we are trying to be very mindful. We want to create ordinances that can be enforced and that regulate parking in our city and make sure that businesses can operate properly in their neighborhoods. But we also want to be mindful to the folks who are living in these vehicles, because this is their only place they can live. And so we do have a number of organizations that we are working with that are doing outreach in these particular areas that have a lot of RVs. And we have allocated about, I think, 30 days from the last council meeting to the next one. So 30 days in which we're going to do very strong outreach and see if we can help as many folks as possible before we start enforcing. I do know that we have, I'm getting questions from folks who are seeing me looking at my phone. I'm getting questions on my people are texting me, and there's one question I'd love the chief to, before we move on to some of the other questions. It is about
Mon, can you make sure you talk right?
Oh, sorry, yes. Why, you mentioned on the, this is going back to the case of Hector Hernandez, and I know you said that you can't really talk about it because it's investigation. Could you explain why can't you answer questions during an investigation based on information that has already been released to the public?
So that's, when I talk about the process, for example, the agreement, when an incident happens and there's video, for example, of the incident, technically that video is evidence in the case, and that evidence belongs to the district attorney's office. Through agreements with the county chiefs, we have reached an agreement with the district attorney's office to release the videos contemporaneous to the event so that we can provide as much context and transparency to the community as allowed in that short amount of time. It doesn't allow for continued updates of additional videos to be released by me without consultation from the district attorney's office because it's their investigation. And I have to be very careful. I don't want to in any way influence an investigation in another body that's completely separate from us doing that investigation, or even have the appearance in the community that that's what I'm trying to do. And so that's one of the reasons why we put out the initial information and we stand behind the information. Anybody can go watch the video. We put it out for everybody to see. And then we allow the process to play out and the district attorney's office to render their decision at the end of that. That's kind of the process that we agreed to in concept when this process was started. And so we were one of the first agencies in Orange County to release videos on our encounters with folks. We are committed to doing so. The trouble with once litigation is filed, anything that I say or any platform that I'm on could be utilized against the city. And so the advice of counsel is always not to comment any further on a specific incident than what has already been placed out there.
And the follow-up question to that also is, when an officer is involved in an incident, what is the process of either keeping them on the job or removing them from their job either temporarily or permanently?
So the process is, the assignments of the officers is my discretion, and I make the decision on whether an officer remains in the field or is assigned elsewhere. In Fullerton, how the process works is if an officer or officers are involved in an incident or witness an incident, perhaps there was a shooting and one officer did not shoot, but one officer did, both officers have to go see a psychologist prior to being released to full duty. And that's one of the processes that goes on right after the incident takes place. The officer is available to legal counsel, and the interview that's going to take place is going to be conducted by the district attorney's office because they're looking into the criminality of the officer's actions. So we do not interfere in that conversation. We are, my major incident review team sergeant will participate and watch the interview, and then that sergeant's job is to report back to me on the details of that interview to provide context with all the other things, tactics, training, policy, procedures, for me to make my decision on the officer's assignment. In some cases, we've kept officers out longer. In other cases, absent any information that on its face violates policies or procedures or the law, then the officer is generally released to full duty after that review takes place.
Thank you.
Excellent. So I don't know if I probably can't answer this right now, but maybe later. Michael asked a question about what is the racial and gender demographics among the Fullerton police officers. Is there a place that they could find out that, or?
I think I might be able to help a little bit with this. It's probably 8 months old and we've had people leave. So in our sworn ranks, we're about 54% Caucasian, 3% African-American, 36% Latino, 4% Asian and Pacific Islander, and then 2% who have 2 or more races. If you include our civilian employees, we're 52% Caucasian, 3% African-American, 34% Latino, 6% Asian Pacific Islander, 1% American Indian or Alaska Native, and then 1% who identify with 2 or more. And we're 66% male and 33% female, sworn and unsworn.
All right, thank you. You had that information, that's wonderful. And then Jane wanted to know about the chief, how are you taking community input on the use of force policies, and what are the next steps on how involving that community in that?
So we covered this at our last meeting when I was looking back at the questions. Our policy is provided by a company called Lexipol. and I know there's concerns about Lexipol's validity and what they do and how they seek input. The fact of the matter is a lot of our policies, whether it's use of force or pursuit or you name the policy, is dictated not only by the department, but case law, changes in legislation. And so the reason why it's important for us to have a company who is devoted to keeping our policy manual up to date and defensible is because a judge can make a decision today that affects our policy tonight, and it needs to be changed immediately. And if we were to take that on ourselves inside the department, I would need a staff of people to monitor the court cases and implement those changes, which we simply can't afford. Most agencies in the region use Lexipol to do that. And so I do get feedback from members of our community, and I would encourage you to look at our website under SB 978. It's our policy manual is on there. It already encompasses the changes that were made by our legislature last year. And so I think the best way for people to give me feedback about our policies is to email me directly, and I'd be happy to have conversations with you about how or why they are the way that they are. But know that the biggest driver of our policies and how we conduct business is the law and case law. And so those things will always be a great consideration. We look at our policy manual. One of the things I think that we touched on last time was when I took over, the police department had taken the Lexipol policy and had done like 78% revision to it. And Lexipol policy said, we're no longer going to support you. You're on your own. And so we had to take a look at our policy manual and go back to a more Lexipol centered policy. And I think if you went to websites of other agencies, because we're required by law to post our policy manual online, you would see that they're very similar from city to city to city. And that's because it's rooted in the law and in case law.
Thank you very much. And it's 20 minutes after our 6 o'clock, so we need to wrap this up. But I really want to thank you for your time, Chief Dunn, and for both Ahmad and for Leanna for arranging this opportunity for the community to come together. There are more questions, so I will share them with you. I have invited them to also send me those questions, and I'll update that as well. I want to also thank Dr. Perez for providing the translation for the Spanish-speaking residents. They really appreciate that and your time this evening, so they could also be able to hear and also include and questions and answers as well. Final comments for you, Leanna, and then Ahmad.
Thank you, Debbie, and thank you, Dr. Perez, for translating, and for all the board members and for all the community members who shared their questions. I think they were very, very good questions. We are limited in our time. Obviously, there are so many things that we can talk about in depth, but always feel free. I remember the last time we did this, we had a slew of emails that came with more questions, and the chief was kind enough to spend some time and ask those questions and answer those questions. So feel free to email us and email me or email anyone from the collaborative, Debbie or Leanna or the chief directly, and we'll try to get those answered to you. One of the things I think that we can all agree on, we're going to probably differ on a lot of things here and there, but one thing that we can all agree on is that we all want good public safety, and we all want to ensure that everybody is heard and that we communicate with each other in an effective way so that we can actually always improve on this public safety. So that is where we should always start, and that's what I hope this has at least achieved, and gave you some taste and some insight that we are listening. I certainly this is something very important to me, and I know the chief has listened, and we are trying to improve as much as possible, and we'll continue to do that. So we'll do another follow-up in a few months, maybe towards the end of the year, and see how we're doing as well. So again, thank you, Leanna, for being a moderator here. And
thank you so much for involving the Fullerton Collaborative. And on that vein of having conversations, please know, community, that in the city of Fullerton, the Collaborative is here for you. And if there's other subject matter or discussions that you feel that need to be brought to a head and talked about, that's what the Fullerton Collaborative is here for. You could be a member just by yourself or through your organization, and we are all we want to do is to come together to communicate, to have a better Fullerton. That is our main mission as the collaborative. So please reach out to us so we can be a support system for you to help facilitate those very important conversations.
Thank you for Chief Dunn for always being responsive and for coming here and sitting on the hot seat. So thank you for that. I don't know if you have any last comments as well.
I can't thank you enough for the platform and the ability to speak with members of the community. I'm looking forward to further collaboration with you. So thank you all for having me and thank you for listening.
Excellent. Thank you. Yes, and we're invited to come to our next collaborative meeting, which will be the second Monday of each month. We meet normally in the library where they're sitting at, but we are doing Zoom for safety issues. So our next meeting will be on April 12th, and we've invited the mayor, Bruce Whitaker, to join us. So you are welcome to join as well. We'll be streaming just like this through our Facebook page, and we hope that you can join us. Thank you, everyone, and have a great evening.
Thank you.